All right. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing before you, O Yahweh, my rock and my redeemer.
Amen.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shalom.
And happy Hanukkah. It's truly a appropriate time for us to be having this initial meeting of a congregation that is in a way 17 years old and in a way brand new.
Yes.
So this is the feast of the rededication of the temple.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that our first meeting is during Hanukkah. So I bet my book hit that. I'm sorry. My book turned that on. All right. All right. Hanukkah is a beautiful time of year. First of all, when we talk about Hanukkah, Hanukkah is not Christmas. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. Yeshua actually kept Hanukkah. Look in your scriptures in John chapter 10, verses 22 through 23. John chapter 10, verses 22 through 23. Now it was the feast of Hanukkah. The feast of Hanukkah, was held in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Yeshua was walking in the temple in the porch of Solomon. And you may have different readings in your different translations, like the Feast of Dedication or something like that. It's Hanukkah, okay? It's the Feast of Hanukkah. Now, some people, when you point this out to them, will say, well, so what? He happened to be there. He was there all the time. That's actually not the point of the context of this passage. Let's turn back a couple of pages to John chapter 7, verse 1, and see why there's so much significance to the fact that Yeshua was there at Hanukkah. John 7:1 says, after these things, Yeshua was walking in Galilee, and he did not want to walk in Yehuda or Judea, because the Judeans wanted to kill him. Okay, so he was up in Galilee, and he was hanging out there, and he didn't want to come down to Judea because the people of Judea wanted to kill him. And then the next few verses say, and the Feast of Tabernacles of the Judeans was near, and his brother said to Yeshua, depart from here and go into Judea or Yehuda, that your Talmudim might see the works that you do. For there is no one who does anything in secret and desires that he be known in public. If you do these things, show your nephesh to the world. For not even his brothers had trust in Yeshua. Yeshua said to them, my time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. For the world is not able to hate you, but it hates me, because I testify against it, that its works are evil. Interesting, Christmas is a time when the whole world claims to love Yeshua, when in fact he said the whole world hates him. Basically calling him a liar. Go up to this feast. I will not go up now to this feast, because my time is not yet fulfilled. He said these things, and he stayed in Galilee. And after his brothers had gone up to the feast, he also went up, not in the open, but in a secret manner. So here it is, just a couple of months earlier, and Sukkot, time for Sukkot, Tabernacles. And Yeshua's brothers come to him and say, hey, let's all go to the temple for the Feast of Tabernacles. And Yeshua doesn't want to go because he's in danger there. The Judeans want to kill him. And he says, no. But after his brothers leave, he goes after all, but he sneaks in, takes an unusual route, and he sneaks into town. Okay. And the rest of John chapter 7, verse 11, all the way through John chapter 10, verse 21, tell us what happened in Jerusalem while Yeshua was in Judea for Sukkot, for the Feast of Tabernacles. And then John chapter 10, verse 22, jumps 2 months ahead in time to Hanukkah and says, now the Feast of Hanukkah was in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Yeshua was walking in the temple in the Porch of Solomon, or the Porch of Sham. So it's 2 months later. Now Yeshua wasn't hanging out in Judea for those 2 months because he had to sneak into town and the Judeans wanted to kill him. So what's going on here? He actually, clearly, he had to have come back to Judea again. So everything that we read in chapter 7 in reference to the Feast of Tabernacles would also apply here to chapter 10 in reference to the Feast of Hanukkah. Yeshua risked his life to be there for Hanukkah. He wasn't just happened to be there at Hanukkah. He actually made such a point, it was so important for him to be at the temple for Hanukkah that he risked his life just like he risked his life to be there for Tabernacles. That's the context of the passage. So there's no doubt Yeshua was celebrating Hanukkah. For those that like to criticize us and say, well, it's not one of the feasts in the Torah in Leviticus chapter 23. So what is Hanukkah? Hanukkah is not, as I say, Christmas. Hanukkah is the celebration of a military victory. In fact, people put the little Christmas display out in their yard with the Christmas story. I can just see somebody putting the Hanukkah story out there, out in the yard with Mattathias thrusting a lance through the Greco-Syrian soldier. But in other words, it's a very different story altogether. Hanukkah is the story of a victory of Judaism over Greek culture. After the reign, at the time of the reign of Alexander the Great, there's a very interesting story about that. The Jewish people had been given special dispensation by Alexander the Great to continue in their practices and not to be Hellenized. But after Alexander the Great died, he left his kingdom was divided up by 4 generals. This is why, by the way, in the prophecy in Daniel, the leopard has 4 heads. Okay? The 2 empires that come into play primarily in the Hanukkah story and in the scriptures are the kingdom of Syria and the kingdom in Egypt, king of the north and the king of the south in the book of Daniel. And Antiochus Epiphanes was the king of the north. He was the king of Syria. And Antiochus Epiphanes, he took the name Epiphanes, which basically meant God manifest. And he passed a decree that nobody should worship anything but him. He was Zeus incarnate. And so he required all the communities to make offerings and offerings only to him. And he came into Jerusalem and he took the temple and he sacrificed a pig on the altar as a sacrifice to Zeus / Nimrod at being himself. Now, you have to understand, this highlights the difference between Christmas and Hanukkah right here. That Christmas ham, that traditional Christmas ham, actually goes back to the fact that the favored offering to Nimrod throughout the centuries under his various incarnations and names was the boar or the pig, because Nimrod had been killed by a boar and he wanted revenge on the boar or the pig So the traditional offering to Nimrod was a pig or a boar, same thing. And so that pig that is slaughtered on the altar in the Hanukkah story that desecrates the temple, that's the Christmas ham. Okay? That's the Christmas ham. The Hanukkah story tells us how Mattathias and his sons, the Maccabees, refused to take part in this. In fact, when the Greco-Syrian soldiers came into town and tried to force the people of Mattathias' town to perform such an offering in the town, Mattathias refused, and he was filled with such a righteous anger that he took a lance from one of the soldiers and killed them both. And he and his sons rode up into the Judean mountains, or ran up into the Judean mountains, and they fought guerrilla warfare for 3.5 years in the hills of Judea. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about biblical prophecy in this later, in a few minutes, but that's the Hanukkah story. At the end of 3 years, they actually came back, and on the very same day that the altar had been desecrated, they recaptured the temple. And what they did was they decided, it was the 25th of Kislev, they decided to go ahead and keep the last festival that they had missed, which was Sukkot, or Tabernacles. So they decided to go back and do a late, belated tabernacle celebration. Of course, we know Tabernacles is 8 days long, 7 days plus an 8th day. And Tabernacles, by the way, was the original festival of light. In the Talmud, we read how there was a big 75-foot menorah in Jerusalem that they would light bonfires on top of that lit up the entire city and could be seen for miles. By the way, that was the setting in John chapter 8, I think it's in John chapter 8, where Yeshua says, I am the light of the world. That big 75-foot menorah with bonfires lighting up the entire city was in the background behind him when he says, I am the light of the world. Okay, so Hanukkah was the original festival of lights. It was also where Christmas gets gift giving from. Believe it or not, if you read in the book of Esther, it says that when they made Purim a Jewish feast or festival, one of the things that they did to celebrate that was they exchanged gifts. Of course, gift exchanges in ancient times were characteristic of all the Jewish festivals, but they eventually centered in on Hanukkah only. So Hanukkah is the opposite, the antipathy of Christmas. Whereas Hanukkah is the acceptance and the incorporation of pagan customs and practices, Hanukkah celebrates the victory over and the rejection of those pagan practices. So anyone who mistakes Hanukkah for Christmas misses the whole point. Hanukkah is anti-Christmas. Hanukkah is the opposite of Christmas. It's not anything like Christmas. The whole point of Hanukkah is contrary to the point of Christmas. Now, Paul tells us, in reference to the feasts, he tells us in Colossians 2:17 that they are a shadow of things to come. A shadow of things to come. And in the Torah, we read that the feasts are a mikra, it says in Hebrew. And that's translated convocation. But one of the meanings of the word mikra is to act something out. In other words, the feasts are all prophetic. They all have a prophetic fulfillment. Passover had a prophetic fulfillment. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. We could do a whole teaching on that. We don't have time, but we could do a whole teaching today. But we could do a whole teaching in the future on the prophetic fulfillments of all the feasts. So, Hanukkah would also have a prophetic fulfillment. And Hanukkah foreshadows prophecy more strongly than any other feast, period. Okay? Excuse me. Hanukkah foretells the last days. First, the first part of the story of Hanukkah is there's a paganization of Israel, a falling away of Israel that we read about in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. That parallels what prophecy tells us in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, that there would be an apostasy that would come in the last days. Interestingly, as the Hanukkah story gets going in 2 Maccabees chapter 4, a new high priest arises in Israel. But this high priest, he actually is a fake high priest. He purchased the high priesthood. Okay, so he's not a real high priest. And his name was Yeshua. Okay? Now, before you have a heart attack, the interesting thing about the fake high priest, though, was that he didn't like using that name Yeshua. He preferred his Greek name, Jason or Jesus. And he went by the Greek name Jesus. The beast of Revelation chapter 13, which is a composite of the four beasts in Daniel chapter 7, commits the abomination of desolation in the book of Revelation and in the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew chapter 24, you may recall, talks about the abomination of desolation and refers it to the book of to the book of Daniel. Well, the book of Daniel, that ties into the abomination of desolation, ties into the conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. And if you study prophecy in the book of Daniel, it's very clear that the king of the north is prophetically Antiochus Epiphanes. So the abomination of desolation, Antiochus Epiphanes offering a pig on the altar, has an exact prophetic parallel. In fact, it is fulfilled twice. Prophecies are often fulfilled more than once. The abomination of desolation was fulfilled more than once. In Matthew chapter 24, Yeshua refers to the book of Daniel in reference to the abomination of desolation. And if you study the book of Daniel, it's clearly talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, and yet Yeshua seems to be talking about something future to him, not past to him. And in fact, there is an abomination of desolation to come. That abomination of desolation begins a 3.5-year period in prophecy. A 3.5-year period in which Judah goes up into the mountains of Judea, into the wilderness of Judea, for a period of 3.5 years before the ultimate end. Of course, Mattathias soon died and was replaced by his son Judas Maccabee, or Yehuda. So Yehuda and his fellows were also in the wilderness for 3.5 years. In 2 Maccabees and in 4 Maccabees, we find out that what was happening in Jerusalem during those 3.5 years was that people that were insisting upon keeping Torah were being captured and tortured and killed. There's the story of Eliezer, who refused to eat meat that was offered up to idols and was killed for it. And the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, who were each executed one at a time. All of this parallels the martyrs of the tribulation. When Judas Maccabee prevails in the war and defeats the Greco-Syrians, he becomes both king and priest. And of course, the Messiah, when he returns to end the 3.5-year period, will also become both king and priest. A new temple was dedicated at Hanukkah, and in Ezekiel chapter 40, verses 40 through 48, and in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 through 19, we read about a new millennial temple. And we also read in these passages of Zechariah 14, 16 through 19, that during the millennial kingdom, the Gentiles will be coming to Jerusalem to celebrate what? The Feast of Tabernacles, which is why the Feast of Tabernacles is closely tied to the millennial kingdom. And when Judas and the Maccabees took the temple and rededicated the altar, they began a Feast of Tabernacles. And I'm going to save the last parallel first I want to talk about the Hanukkah miracle. You probably heard the phrase, Nes Gadol Hayah Sham. It means a great miracle happened there. In fact, the little letters on the dreidel are the first letter for each of those words. Nes Gadol Hayah Sham. It's a major part of the Hanukkah story. But some people say it never happened. And the reason they say it never happened is, well, it's never mentioned in the books of the Maccabees. And the argument is that originally Hanukkah was about the military victory, but when the Jewish people decided, the Pharisees decided they really didn't like the Maccabees that much, they decided to kind of shift feet and emphasize this miracle of the oil. And so they argued it never happened. Now the miracle of the oil is mentioned in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud in 21b. It says, what is the reason for Hanukkah? For our rabbis taught, on the 25th of Kislev begins the days of Hanukkah, which are 8, during which lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils in it, and when the Hasmonean dynasty, that's the Maccabees, prevailed against and defeated them, they searched and found only one cruse of oil which possessed the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient oil for only 1 day's lighting. Yet a great miracle occurred there, and they lit the lamp for 8 days. The following year was appointed a festival with the recitation of the Hallel and the Thanksgiving. The Hanukkah miracle is also mentioned in a document called the Megillat Antiochus, which dates to around 200 CE or 200 AD. It says, the Hasmoneans entered the sanctuary, rebuilt the gates, closed the breaches, and cleansed the temple court from the slain and the impurities. They looked for pure olive oil to light the menorah and found only one bottle with the seal of the high priest, so that they were sure of its purity. Though its quantity seemed sufficient only for 1 day's lighting, it lasted for 8 days, owing to the blessing of the Elohim of heaven, who had established his name there. Hence, the Hasmoneans and all Jews alike instituted these 8 days as a time of fasting and rejoicing, like any festival prescribed in the Torah, and of the kindling of lights to commemorate the victories that Elohim gave them. So, the miracle of the oil is mentioned in the Talmud, and it is also mentioned in the roll of Antiochus. But there's more reason to believe that the miracle happened. The miracle of the oil is not mentioned in the books of the Maccabees, but it is very, very strongly implied. Okay? If we read 2 Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 10 through 18, chapter 1, verse 10 through 2:18, we find that there's a pair of letters that are being sent from Judas Maccabee and the Jewish community in Jerusalem that has just defeated the Greco-Syrians and is setting up Jewish shop again, to the Jews that live in Egypt and the Egyptian empire down there, the Ptolemaic empire. And so they're writing to them, and they're telling them why they ought to celebrate Hanukkah. That's the purpose of the letter, is why you should celebrate Hanukkah. After all, it's not one of the feasts in Leviticus 23, so why should you celebrate? And so they make an argument for Hanukkah, and they begin in chapter 1, verse 19 of 2 Maccabees. For when our fathers were led into Persia, the priests that were devout took fire of the altar privately and hid it in a hollow place of a pit without water, where they kept it sure, so that the place was unknown to all men. Now after many years, when it pleased Elohim, Nehemiah, being sent from the king of Persia, did send of the posterity of those priests that had hid it to the fire, But they told us that they found no fire, but thick water. That's what describes it as thick water. Then commanded he to draw it up and bring it, and when the sacrifices were laid on, Nehemiah commanded the priests to sprinkle the wood and the things laid upon them with the water. And when this was done, the time came that the sun shone, and after there was hid in the cloud, there was a great fire kindled, so that every man marveled. And the priests made a prayer whilst the sacrifice was consuming. I say both the priests and all the rest, Jonathan beginning and the rest answering thereunto as Nehemiah did. And the prayer was after this manner: O Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, creator of all things, who are fearful and strong and righteous and merciful, and the only and gracious King, the only giver of all things, the only just, almighty, and everlasting, you that delivered Israel from all trouble, and you did choose the fathers and sanctify them. Receive the sacrifice for the whole people of Israel, and preserve your own portion and sanctify it. Gather those together that are scattered from us, deliver them that serve among the heathen, look upon them that are despised and abhorred, and let the heathen know that you are our Elohim. Punish them that oppress us with pride and do us wrong. Plant your people again in your holy place, as Moses has spoken. And the priests sung songs and thanksgiving. Now when the sacrifice was consumed, Nehemiah commanded the water that was left to be poured on the great stones. And this was done. There was kindled a flame, but it was consumed by the light that shined upon the altar. So when the matter was known, it was told the king of Persia that in the place where the priests were led away and hid the fire, there appeared water, and that Nehemiah had purified the sacrifices therewith. The king enclosed the place, made it holy after he had tried the matter. The king took many gifts and bestowed them thereupon those whom he would gratify. And Nehemiah called this thing Naphtah. Naphtah is Aramaic for oil, petroleum, which is as much to say a cleansing, but many call it naphtha. Okay, so the St. Maccabees is telling us at the time that Nehemiah dedicated the second temple, there was what can only be described as a miracle of the oil. The account then goes on. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. It is also found in the records that Jeremiah the prophet commanded them that were carried away to take of the fire as it has been signified. How the prophet, having given them the law, charged them not to forget the commandments of the Lord, that they should not err in their minds, that they see images of silver and gold with their ornaments. And when other speeches exhorted he them, that the Torah should not depart from their hearts, it was also contained in the same writing that the prophets, being warned of Elohim, commanded the tabernacle and the ark to go with him as he went forth into the mountain, where Moses climbed up and saw the heritage of Elohim. When Jeremiah came there, he found a hollow cave. Therein he laid the tabernacle and the ark. That's whatever happened to the ark, folks. It's where it is, not Moab. And the altar of the incense, and so stopped the door. And some of those that followed him came to mark the way, but they could not find it. Which, when Jeremiah perceived, he blamed them, saying, As for that place, it shall be unknown until the time that Elohim gather his people again together and receive them unto mercy. Then shall Yahweh show them these things, and the glory of Elohim, of Yahweh shall appear in the clouds also, as it was showed under Moses. So, the last days, when the Messiah returns, the ark will reveal its position. And that could only also be described because the ark is not only revealing its position, but what else is in there? The tabernacle and the naphtha, the oil. A miracle of the oil in the last days. Finally, Maccabees goes on and says, and as when Solomon desired that the place might be honorably sanctified, so we're going back now to the sanctification of the very first temple, when Solomon desired that the place might be honorably sanctified, it was also declared that he, being wise, offered the sacrifice of dedication of the finishing of the temple. And when Moses prayed unto the Lord, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifices. Even so prayed Solomon also, and fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings. And Moses said, because the sin offering was not to be eaten, it was consumed. So Solomon kept those 8 days. So they're saying Solomon kept Hanukkah too, because there was a Sukkot actually, but there was also a miracle of the fire that took place at the dedication of the first temple. So why does 2 Maccabees not mention the Hanukkah miracle later in the text? Because it was common knowledge. Not every account of the so-called Christmas story, and I refer to the Christian version of the Christmas story, will mention the virgin birth, but it's common knowledge. So he's telling the story of the Hanukkah story. The miracle of the oil is common knowledge. The whole point to his letter in 2 Maccabees, and 2 Maccabees is the whole book is basically a letter, is to say you should celebrate Hanukkah because there was a miracle of fire at the first dedication of the temple. There was a miracle of oil and fire at the second dedication of the temple. There will be a miracle of the oil and fire at the final dedication of the temple when the Messiah returns. And there's a miracle of the oil now. At this rededication of the temple. So, what is the real meaning of Hanukkah? What is the real meaning of Hanukkah for us today? This is the final evidence of the miracle of the oil, and that is, remember, we talked about how all of the elements of Hanukkah fit biblical prophecy. The Hanukkah miracle of the oil fits biblical prophecy more strongly than any other element. Revelation chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. And I saw another angel who ascended from the rising of the sun, and he had the seal of the living Elohim. And he cried aloud with a loud voice to the 4 angels, those to whom it was given to harm the earth and sea. And he said, do not harm the earth, nor the sea, nor even the trees, until we seal the servants of Elohim between their eyes. And I heard the number of those sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. So there's 144,000 that are sealed in the last days. And there is in the Hanukkah story, they discover only one jar of oil that still has the high priest's seal on it. Let's continue. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 13. And we were chosen in him, even as he marked us out beforehand, and he desired, he who performs everything according to the purpose of his will, that we, those who first hoped in the Messiah, should be to the esteem of his glory. In him also you heard the word of truth, that is, the good news of your life. And in him you believed and were sealed. You're sealed with the Ruach HaKodesh, which was promised, which is the token of our inheritance to the redemption of those who have life into the glory of his honor. So then we're like those jars of oil that are sealed by the high priest. We're sealed by the Holy Spirit. Now, why are we sealed by the Holy Spirit? what does the olive oil that was in the jar, what does oil represent in the scriptures? Anybody?
Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh. In fact, in Zechariah chapter 4, there's this whole vision with the menorah and the pipes of oil going into the menorah. Okay? And Revelation chapter 11, those parallel the two witnesses. And the two witnesses are filled with the Ruach, sealed with the seal of the Holy Spirit. And we also have the parable of the virgins and the virgins that had the oil. So when the Messiah returns, he finds a remnant, a very small remnant, that have the seal of the Ruach HaKodesh and are filled with the oil, filled with the Ruach HaKodesh. Just as when Judas Maccabee returned to the temple after it had been desecrated and they recaptured it, he found only one jar, a very small remnant, of oil that's in a jar that had the seal of the high priest, that then was used to institute an 8-day Feast of Tabernacles, just as we will institute an 8-day, 1,000-year Feast of Tabernacles. So the miracle of the oil is clear because it's prophetic meaning. It's beyond coincidence that there would be such a prophetic meaning to the miracle of the oil if it didn't happen. It's beyond coincidence that 2nd Maccabees would be making the argument repeatedly that you should observe Hanukkah and referring to various miracles of fire and miracles of oil if there had not been a miracle of the oil at the original Hanukkah. So let us take with us today, let us be that remnant as we rededicate this temple, this assembly. Let us be that remnant sealed with the Ruach HaKodesh and filled with the Ruach HaKodesh.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Amen?
Amen.
All right. And you shall eat and be satisfied, and shall bless Yahweh your Elohim in the good land which he has given you. Blessed are you, Yahweh your Elohim, King of the universe, who nourishes the entire world in your grace and mercy. You give nourishment to all flesh. Your kindness is eternal. Our compassionate one, through your great goodness, we have never lacked, and may we never lack nourishment for all eternity. For the sake of your great name, you prepare food for all the creatures that you have created. We thank you for your provisions with which you nourish and sustain us continually, every day and every season. May your great name, O Yahweh, be blessed by the mouth of all the living continually for all eternity. Amen and amen. Baruch atah Yahweh Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Amen.
All right.
I have announcements.
Okay.
Tomorrow is the Hanukkah party.